something different going on right now. And what it is, in my view, is that, sort of the rise of this global right, or the world of the right, as some of our colleagues in Ottawa and beyond have called it, seems to be much more structural than conjunctural. Right? We can imagine this movement continuing even after Trump, right? Which is probably why I'm calling it more structural than conjunctural, right? We see it with what just happened in Turkey over the past couple of days, and in Hungary. I mean, those movements have been in those countries for much longer than Trump himself. Diplomacy has become very much attached to a particular way of doing international politics when its potentialities are actually broader than that. Diplomacy has really served over the past few decades to strengthen the monopoly of the state as a form of political organization at a time where a lot of people are asking, well, it's not working for climate change, for instance. It's not working for pandemics. It's not. So to a certain extent, that I think is the real challenge to diplomacy today. I'm very, very happy and excited about the way that practice theory has developed. I mean, when I started to work on that during my PhD, it was not even a thing, right? It was weird to talk about Bourdieu and do that kind of stuff. So I would have never imagined, that would be picked up the way that it has since. Sort of underground work of nurturing relationships, even when it looks like nothing's coming out of it, I think is really sort of key to smaller states or weaker actors diplomacy. If you look at NATO right now, the fact that the Germans are asking the French about their nuclear deterrent, that's a sea change that nobody, and I'm pretty sure that nobody would have seen coming a year ago, right? The Germans have been very pro-American, at least when it comes to military cooperation, for understandable reasons, and to realize that they now want to talk to the French, and de Gaulle would probably smile in his tomb for making the choices he made in the 50s and 60s. Let me put it differently. I would say the club of states is much more resilient than what sometimes we may be tempted to think there is with AI. When I think about the world, the most concerning thing, I think, for me, even more than climate change, because I think it's more immediate in its effect, is the concentration of political, economic capital and technological capital in the hands of a few individuals, a few corporations who know more about each of us than, the KGB would pale in comparison during the Cold War in terms of being able to read its citizens and class. I mean, AI and translation is going to change the nature of diplomacy.
Absolutely.
Let's say there will be a decrease in language skills in diplomatic corps. Well, what that means is that the linguistic skills will also increase in value because they will become more rare, right? So there's, again, something paradoxical to it. But so I think that there will be ways in which, despite all the trends toward AI-assisted translation, those few who still master foreign languages and develop cultural competence will have some value. It's just that it will distribute. That diplomacy is conservative.
I'm very happy to introduce my guest today, Dr. Vincent Pouliot. He is a James McGill Professor at McGill University in Canada, and he is also director of the Center for International Peace and Security Studies there. Vincent is a very well-known scholar in the fields of international relations, diplomatic studies, global governance, and he has many, many titles, achievements, but you could find all this in the description. I'm so happy to see you, Vincent. Thank you so much for your time.
Very happy to be there as well, Asher, and it's great to see you again. We met a long time ago when you visited McGill. I think it was around 2010, if I'm not wrong.
I spent 2 months at your center in 2014.
14. Okay, sorry. I had kids in those years, and so everything is a little bit mixed up. But
already 11 years, but it was a wonderful time. Thank you so much for
same for me. Yeah,
that opportunity. I was very happy.
Yeah. Me too.
So, Vincent, let's start from discussing, if you don't mind, some general topics. Then we will go to some specific issues. So, there are a lot of things are going on around. If we look at our current moment, some people see this as a turning point in world history. Some people may see this as, well, just adaptation to some new realities. Some people say, well, perhaps we will see some new world order is emerging. How is your perception? How do you see everything, what's going on in the world from these perspectives?
I like how you start small, Alisher.
Right, that's all. Small start.
No, no, but that's a very good question. That's an important one. I think when I try to reflect on issues like this, I'm always a bit of two minds in the following sense. That the first thought that comes to my mind is that we have to be careful in the sense that as human beings, I think we all have a tendency, and I include myself, of course, to think that we live in exceptional times and that things were never as critical as they were before. Which is we have our nose against the big window, and I think that there's something absolutely legitimate and reasonable in feeling that way. At the same time, though, history teaches us, and not even like ancient history, recent history also teaches us that we also felt that way to a similar extent, not exactly the same, for instance, when the neocons and Bush Jr. took power in the United States a quarter of a century ago. I mean, there were several moments in the 70s, I think, there was also a similar moment of reckoning. So, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, let's keep things in context. This is not the first time that the world is in upheaval, and this is not going to be the last either, right? At the same time, and this is very important, it is true that in my view, and I know that this is shared by many of our colleagues, there seems to be uh, something different going on right now. And what it is, in my view, is that, sort of the rise of this global right, or the world of the right, as some of our colleagues in Ottawa and beyond have called it, seems to be much more structural than conjunctural, right? And that's a big change. It's not one government elected in an important country that is creating some tensions in the world. It's actually something that seems to be not only more widespread geographically around the world, but also deeper, right? It seems to have deeper roots ideologically, in terms of organization, and sort of, in that sense, I think that we're seeing much more of a kind of a concerted challenge or alternative to the sort of the so-called liberal. I'm not quite sure that I would agree that it's necessarily liberal, but what we typically refer to as the liberal order that emerges after the Second World War, but frankly keeps morphing in ensuing decades into the 90s and early 21st century. So, again, I think that, just like anything else, the Trump moment itself, which is on everybody's mind, especially here in Canada, I can tell you that, there's not like, it's impossible not to think about Trump every hour of our lives. And I'm not just specialists like us. I mean, like even for lay citizens, but just like anything else, the Trump moment will pass, right? Like in a few years, we'll be somewhere else. The thing is, does this current trouble hinge entirely on the shoulders of a single man? I'm not quite sure. He's definitely sort of a leader of the current challenges. Um, but it seems to me that maybe one thing that is slightly different about this time is the fact that we can imagine this movement continuing even after Trump, right? Which is probably why I'm calling it more structural than conjunctural, right? We see it with what just happened in Turkey over the past couple of days, and in Hungary. I mean, those movements have been in those countries for much longer than Trump himself. Brazil. I mean, we can multiply, and sort of Russia, and so there's something there that I think we cannot be easily dismissed. At the same time, I think it's also important to keep our cool and see that history, is a much longer process than one term of one president. So
Right. Well, perhaps it's a very interesting time to test agency structure related to here. We will see which will prevail, agency or structure. So anyway, I understand that perhaps it has a very deep roots, not just everything what's going on related to current situation, but much more deeper, and perhaps it will take some time to really understand all this, have a bigger picture, right?
Yeah, and I think that part of the problem also is with those who may think differently, for instance, than those challengers. So let's say the incumbents of the liberal order who have been very slow, and again, I include myself, I'm no better than others, but very slow at uh, realizing that this thing has been brewing and emerging for, again, I think you can certainly trace it back to the 70s and then in various shapes and forms, right? But even the Reagan, revolution at the time had some kind of populist, nationalist undertones to it. Thatcher in the UK, of course. And so these things have been around. It's just like, I think that, the consensus looked so strong, especially for those who were happy about it, that in the 90s, right, it was very triumphant, right? Like the everybody knows the story about the end of history. And I think that part of the current sort of waking up and very abrupt and difficult waking up also has to do not only with Trump himself, but also with kind of failure on the part of citizens and leaders, but also academics like you and I, Alisher, to uh, acknowledge and recognize a set of claims and grievances, with which we may agree or not, but that's not the point, right? We study politics. We want to understand how people clash based on what kinds of systems of meanings. And so, to understand how people think, where they're coming from, is our job. Whether we agree or not, for me, is immaterial. And I think
Yeah.
that we haven't been very good, or at least I wish we had been better, just to make sense of that a little bit ahead of the curve. And now we find ourselves past the curve and we're like, ooh, what's going on? So, yeah.
That's very important. Since this channel is devoted to diplomacy, let's go to diplomacy. So, how do you see the role of diplomacy in this situation? Is it evolving? Is this state-based diplomacy still dominant, or there are some new trends? And we're witnessing that new forms of diplomacy are emerging. So, how do you look at diplomacy from global perspective?
That's a good question. I think that diplomacy has sort of served, or diplomats, if you want to think about human beings instead, diplomats have served under all kinds of ideological and institutional complexes over time, right? Diplomacy has served conservative monarchies, for instance, post-concert Europe. It served revolutionary administrations, in all kinds of contexts, whether it's communist or post-colonial forms of diplomatic activism. So I've never quite thought of diplomacy as necessarily sort of inherent to one particular ideology or institutional setup. I think it has a kind of I don't want to say transhistorical, but there is something quite, continuous in the form of the interpolity relationships and engagement. Now, all that being said, and again, I'm going to nuance what I just said. I think that diplomacy, in the way that it's emerged or evolved over the past few decades, has been very closely involved with the so-called liberal order, right? And so um, there is a sense in which diplomacy is also under attack because of the way in which diplomacy has served a certain understanding of what international relations should be, for instance, based on multilateralism, based on international organizations, but also based on a club of state, right? You were mentioning new challenges and all of that. Diplomacy has really served over the past few decades to strengthen the monopoly of the state as a form of political organization at a time where a lot of people are asking, well, it's not working for climate change, for instance. It's
Right.
not working for pandemics. It's not. So, to a certain extent, that I think is the real challenge to diplomacy today. It's not to reinvent itself, because that's sort of a facile way of putting it, but definitely to sort of uh, uh, go back to the sort of the spirit, which is essentially one of dialogue within the framework of difference, right? But without necessarily all this very close associations that have evolved over time, be more open to the possibility, I think, of evolving. And again, I'm talking about the club of state. I'm thinking about um, the way we think about, for instance, when there is a global challenge, we generate these mechanisms. And so I think that that's the big challenge. It's the fact that diplomacy has become very much attached to a
Mm.
particular way of doing international politics, when its potentialities are actually broader than that. If
So
we interpret it the way that you have, for instance, in your works, Alisher, or other people. Yeah.
it's a very challenging time for diplomacy, since in the past it was mainly a servant to any kinds of political movements, regimes, etc. But now it may, who knows, may become much more powerful, which kind of have more agentic kinds of functions. Would you agree with that?
Um, I understand what you mean. I think, I've always thought that diplomats matter, right? And their practices and the individuals, they matter greatly. But, their work is heavily constrained, but also enabled by the state system, by the instructions. You've been a
Right.
diplomat yourself, Alisher. You know very well what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. You receive instructions and you work from your capital's instructions. And, that's not, there's nothing um, normatively good or bad about that. That's just what being a diplomat is, right? You represent a larger entity. And so, on a spectrum, I think you can imagine, well, on one end, well, you have situations which we have known over the past few decades in some organizations, where instructions across the different capitals and countries are very much aligned, and there that creates a space for diplomats to really generate compromises and cooperation and collaboration. And you can have at the other end of the spectrum a scenario which seems to be the one on the rise, where actually instructions clash, right? And it's very difficult for diplomats to come to an agreement. Let's think about NATO right now, for instance, but there would be other examples. But all that being said, despite the fact that there's kind of a geopolitical movement along that spectrum, I don't think that diplomats, and I know that's not what you suggested, Alisher, but just to reinforce the point, diplomats are not less useful when preference heterogeneity is higher among capitals, right? When instructions clash. I think, on the contrary, that opens up a different kind of space for diplomacy, less so about signing documents and agreeing on treaties, much more about finding ways to translate clashing instructions into a kind of, at the very least, finding terms around which to disagree, for instance, as opposed to simply, speaking past one another. And it's true that in the public eye, that kind of diplomacy doesn't make headlines, right? We don't laud or applaud diplomats because they couldn't agree, they couldn't sign the treaty, but they also, through this negotiation and discussion, they managed, first of all, to maintain relationships where
Mm.
otherwise it would be possible that states would just say, we're fed up with that
Right.
process. We
Right.
don't want to. We don't want to continue. And so, I can totally see how diplomacy will have a hard time delivering tangible sort of outcomes
Mm.
in the short, medium term. But in a way, for me, that suggests that diplomacy may be even more important, in the sense that that's sort of what's keeping the lid, from boiling, in the sense that when you continue to talk, diplomats have this quality. They also have challenges, but have this quality of, uh, not putting an end to a social relationship because it's conflictual, right? And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
that's one of the most important things right now that diplomats can provide, is just stand back a little bit and realize that disagreements and conflicts have been part of international
Mm.
politics forever. It will also in the future. This is not the first time, not the last. We're not gonna, throw everything away for that reason. We're gonna continue to talk and where needed, and agree to disagree. So I think there's sort of there's
Okay.
still a way for diplomacy.
All right, that's a good point. How about diplomatic studies? So, do you see that it's a dynamically developing field, promising? How do diplomatic studies coping with realities, particularly with diplomatic practice? So, your perception and your view on diplomatic studies.
That's a great question. I think diplomatic studies is, and of course I'm biased because I'm part of it, but trying to look at it from a bit of distance, if I can, I think it's a very healthy subsection or section of the ISA right now. Uh, of course, our predecessors have worked a lot. We did a panel, Alicia, I think you were present in Chicago at the ISA conference around Iver Neumann as a sort of distinguished scholar
Yeah,
award. And, Iver's been at the forefront of developing diplomatic studies in new directions
right.
for at least 3 decades now. There have been other people, and of course, I include you here. Uh, I think that some of the nicest things I've seen in diplomatic studies recently, certainly, I think that the field has been pretty good. I mean, there's been a gap, in terms of catching up to reality, but I think that that's normal, part of academia, but pretty good at catching up with the digital revolution in diplomacy.
Mm,
I think that, I remember teaching a class that's called Diplomacy in Practice, and in the first few years of diplomacy and all of that, there was just
right.
nothing. Well, there were a few things, but no in-depth quality, theoretically informed analysis of what is at stake in
Mm,
those transformations. And nowadays, it's relatively easy to find these
yeah,
kinds of material. I'm
good
thinking about
point.
Rebecca Adler-Nissen or Cornelio Biola and Marcus
Right.
Korn. I mean, like, there's lots of really good studies on this to help us understand how that change matters. Another development that is sure, and I'll stop after that I think is important is I think that there is more, and again, I would credit Iver and others for that. There is more interest for historicizing diplomacy, and in a
Mm,
way, that's sort of a return to more classical diplomatic
mm,
studies. Because if you look at how diplomatic studies used to be done, there were sort of a lot of these guys were diplomatic historians, right?
right, right.
But what's sort of new, I think, or new, new is always a big word to use, but what's different, what's interesting right now is the fact that this historical interest has now blended with what had happened to diplomatic studies, which was a kind of
Mm,
a theorization, right? Really a
right.
theorizing effort over 2 decades. And the two together worked really well at the ISA. Again, just sorry, it's on my mind because it was recent. I was at a panel on a book panel on Elena Driescheva's most recent book,
Yeah.
where she looks at transformations of international order via what she calls representant, which are essentially sort of almost like material artifacts or social artifacts of order wielded by all kinds of actors, but including diplomats, of course. And just like the combination, and I'm talking about Elena, but we could talk about other colleagues as well. The combination of theory and history, historical depth, for me is something that is very useful, not just for the sake of knowledge development, but in the current era, I think, with all the turmoil we talked about, better understanding where we're coming from helps contextualize what's going on these days. And I think that that's sort of a timely thing for us in diplomatic studies to do, to make sure that history is not lost on our contemporary analysis.
Very interesting. Traditionally in the past, uh, diplomatic studies, first of all, were associated with diplomatic history, study of diplomatic history. Then something happened, more theorizing, more different kinds of theories, diplomacy as a social practice, etc., etc. But now, as you said, it's once again going back to look at the history from more different angles, theoretical, more well-positioned perspectives. That's very interesting. Uh, let's discuss practice theory. Of course, you're a very big name in practice theory, in international relations, in diplomatic studies. Your influence is huge, and it is one of the most dynamic field in diplomatic studies, and more and more people turning to this field, seeing value of it. But how do you see yourself? Because you started thinking about that, bringing to diplomatic studies. So what are some achievements and maybe still some challenges, unfulfilled or unfinished areas of implementation of practice theory in diplomatic studies?
Um, well, that's a big question, but certainly, the first thing to say, Alisher, is that, I'm very, very happy and excited about the way that practice theory has developed. I mean, when I started to work on that during my PhD, it was not even a thing, right?
Right, right.
It was weird to talk about Bourdieu and do that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So I would have never imagined, that would be picked up the way that it has since. And
Right.
the most exciting aspect of it, really, and by far and away, is not what the colleagues with whom I was maybe in the 2000s, early 2000s, trying to push that agenda have done, but rather the later generations. All the PhD students, when you go to ISA or other conferences, especially in Europe, because that's where practice theory is
Mm,
the most, shall we say, popular, or at least the most active.
mhm.
That's what's really exciting. They use practice theory. They're critical of it. They find gaps in it. They push it. They use it in different ways, innovative
Mm,
ways. And that's, for me, that's the most. And of course, I get criticized a lot, but that's completely fine by me. I criticize myself a lot when I look back at what I wrote, and so. Um, that's the most intriguing or an exciting part. When you ask me about from my perspective, what kinds of challenges, on my end, there's been a few things over the past, I'd say probably since Pecking Orders, International Pecking Orders, my book in
yeah.
2016, that have been on my mind. Actually, no, some were all even older concerns of mine that I've allowed myself, I guess also because of the gap during the pandemic where everything slowed down, to really sort of take over my sort of on my priorities list. One I've already mentioned, but it's really grown on me over the past 5-10 years, is historical IR. And I really think that there is an incredible convergence between the so-called historical turn in IR and practice theory. And some people like Eddie Keane, for instance, at Oxford, and his amazing PhD students have really started to dig into that sort of convergence between kind of a social history and practice theory. And again, lots of really, really good works. Again, among keen students, one that really amazes me is Quentin Bruno. He's at New School in New York, and he's wrote a fantastic
Mhm,
book called
mhm,
Masters of Capital. Claire Vergerio, also fantastic book on Gentili's laws of war and how they're used, actually, right? So it's a way of doing international law, international history that's very practice centric. It's not about meaning, it's about how do people use
right.
text and meanings and stuff like that. So that's one thing. Another thing that really has grown on me, and it's not just me, but to talk about my own sort of intellectual evolution, is the importance of structures, right? So I've always been, anybody who's minimally Bourdieusian is obsessed with structures, right? That was also part of his thinking. Um, but I think that for me, so I've, in pecking orders, for instance, I went at length trying to conceptualize and then operationalize all kinds of social structures. I have sort of four, the gig, Alisher. But I think that for me, the one aspect of structure that I felt was still lacking in my work, and you'll see the connection with the first point I made, are historical structures. So structures
Mm,
that are inherited from
mm,
past interactions, from conflict over distributions of resources. And of course, the one thing that, the one historical structure that has um, that has gotten the most my attention over the past, again, 5-10 years are post-colonial structures, right? The fact that actually the world that we live in right now is largely inherited from colonial and decolonial, post-colonial, decolonizing, post-colonial um, relations. And so you cannot think about war, you cannot think about international organizations, about international law, about international organizations without noticing that all of these things emerged and developed concomitantly with colonialism, modern colonialism, and then decolonization after the Second World War. And so I think that for me, this is really where a lot of my thinking has been going on. And so, the challenge, Alisher, is that when you take history and structure seriously, you go more macro, right? And a lot of practice theory in its early developments, including myself, of course, but I think of your great works too, had a more micro flavor, kind of a Goffman type of interactionist
Right.
aspect, which I still very much find very interesting and useful. But it's true that if you ask me, I feel like while we do that, it's also important not to lose sight of those bigger things I've been talking about. And everything is in the balance. And I think I am at least trying to strike the right balance between these different things.
Wonderful. It's very nice to hear all those things from you as a leading scholar in this field, in practice theory. But if we will try to summarize what you said, and again, going back to the point, one or two biggest achievements of practice theory, and one or two biggest challenges in a very short way, what would you say?
Achievements, I think, one of the things that I myself am most happy about practice theory works, and I'm talking about the collective output here, of course, is what I think, and again, this is debatable, but is very much a good balance between theory and empirics. I think one of the strengths of practice theory has been to say, well, we need to theorize. Why? Well, because if we want to develop concepts that can travel and develop analytically general insights, we will have to climb the ladder of abstraction. Otherwise, we're going to be journalists who talk about specific cases. There's nothing wrong about that. But if we want to be able to, find family resemblances between cases and things like that, we'll have to theorize. At the same time, though, theory for its own sake means very little to me, at least, in the sense that it's always in how do you rationalize, how do you then go to the field or whatever your methods are to have the theory and the empirics talk to one another and mutually inform one another. And I think that that's really one thing that I think practice theory has done really well. I think it's also and it's not just practice theory, but developments such as practice theory have helped not move beyond, but find ways forward on some theoretical debates that for me were at risk of becoming stale. I'm thinking of like the norms versus interest, or ideas versus matter, or even agency versus structure. Those are useful heuristics when we teach, for instance, our students to help them understand, well, okay, this is the ontological menu for choice. But when we go on with our research, in my view, at least, it's crazy to think that you can go to one of these different sides and stay there, right? Obviously, it's going to be a combination of that. And I think that practice theory, and again, it's not just practice theory, but practice theory is very practical, sorry for the unintended pun, in terms of saying, well, all of these things will matter, and the challenge is precisely understanding the combination and its variations across time. So those would be my two big achievements. Sorry, you asked me to be really concise, but they're complex questions you're asking, Alisher. I'm trying my best.
You framed wonderfully. It brings some balance between, on the one hand, empirical sides of diplomacy, our understanding of diplomacy, but on the other hand, theory. It's a good balancing approach. That's a wonderful framing. Now, I noticed when I am observing your writings, your scholarship, that for last perhaps some years, you are going bigger and bigger. I mean, in looking to wider picture, more global kinds of perspective. So, of course, you're very famous with some of your absolutely wonderful books, this pecking order, international institutions, but recently you're writing more and more about global governance, global issues, and perhaps also seeing diplomacy as a part of global governance. So in this respect, I wonder, usually when we think about global issues or global governance, it's usually associated with some big powers. So, but how about small powers, medium powers? Are there any role for these smaller countries in global governance? Or it is just a business of big, powerful countries? How do you see the role of medium powers and small countries in global governance?
Um, I mean, that's a good question. I think that one of the things that I've realized, I'm guessing you're referring to my latest book with Jean-Philippe Terrien, Global Policy Making, which is essentially a kind of a study of how global policies are crafted and made at the global level. And we use the United Nations as our key site, but of course, it's a much more diverse cast of actors than just states or the UN itself. And I think that one of the things that we've learned from doing this book, Jean-Philippe and I, is again a sort of a paradox, Alisher. On the one hand, it's clear that powerful states, take the United States, are indeed very powerful and influential in terms of shaping outcomes. And if you look at global policies, if you compare them, you realize that there is still a thing like Western hegemony in the sense that the global policies, broadly speaking, go in the direction that aligns with the preferences of the powerful Western states. At the same time, when you look at the nitty gritty of global policy making, the everyday stuff, right? So I'm still a practice theorist, so we still spent a lot of time tracing the everyday evolution and discourse of our three cases and beyond. You realize that actually the institutional setup is so dense and fragmented, that it's not possible even for the most powerful actors to completely dominate the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think it's this. I know it's a paradox, right? Because I started off by saying, well, they're still very influential. If you look at the policies, they seem to go in a direction. And then I'm saying, well, but when the policies are crafted themselves, it's very complicated. And a lot of small states, smaller agents, not only states, by the way, but also civil society organizations will play roles that definitely defy a purely structuralist understanding of power, right? And so I think it's in that sense. What that does that mean for less powerful actors? Means a number of things that IR scholarship has already sort of dealt with. Definitely, sort of the importance of social ties, of multiplying social ties. It's very important. And that's one thing that Canada these days is learning a very hard way. Is don't put all your eggs in the same basket, right? You have to entertain relationships very broadly, including with people you disagree with, because things shift. You never know when the new alignment will emerge, and so this sort of underground work of nurturing relationships, even when it looks like nothing's coming out of it, I think is really sort of key to smaller states or weaker actors diplomacy. And I would say also the underground work of changing the terms of the debate, the kind of more ideological aspect. One thing we realized, Jean-Philippe and I, in global policy making is that in many cases, some ideas that eventually became very influential on the policy outcome were originally aired by very marginal actors a couple of decades before anybody else picked them up, right? And so there's kind of a very I don't want to say random because that's not what it is, but there is a certain um, messiness to that process. And I think that it's easy to think that only the actions that pay off in the short term matter, when actually, again, if you take a longer view and you cast a wider net, you realize that it's more complicated than that. And sometimes a lot of policy trajectories, Alisher, get discarded. But then there's also a couple that get the upper hand and become policy. And for that reason, I think that it's important to take a bigger picture. When you're a weaker actor, it's not about achieving results right now. It's,
I see.
there's kind
Yeah.
of a longer term game, I think. Yeah.
Very interesting perspective. Perhaps this might be a topic for very good PhD study, the role of medium and small powers in global governance.
Yeah.
Longer perspectives and looking a little differently, not just immediate reaction and actions, but longer perspectives. That's wonderful. Now, I know you spent a lot of time studying international organizations, NATO and others, United Nations. So, could you say a few words about the perspective of these international organizations? How do you see reforms? There are so many things being said about the reforms United Nations in the United Nations, but still very little things being done. So how do you see the perspective of real reforms? Is it possible or no?
Well, again, I think, one thing that's really important to get the conversation started is to bear in mind that international organizations have been withstanding political crisis and storms forever, right? Ever since they emerged in the late 19th century into the 20th century. I don't think that there's ever been a stable, easy moment for international organizations. Perhaps some decades were easier. Let's think about the 90s than others. But even in the 90s, if you remember, the UN was challenged by a number of interventions and so on and so forth. So the first thing to think, I think, is that conflict and crisis are not proofs that international organizations are faltering. It's actually their bread and butter. That's what international organizations face all the time, right? Now, that being said, of course, there are certain crises that seem deeper or more serious than others. I think, if you look at NATO right now, the fact that the Germans are asking the French about their nuclear deterrent, that's a sea change that nobody, and I'm pretty sure that nobody would have seen coming a year ago, right? The Germans
Right.
have been very pro-American, at least when it comes to um, military cooperation for understandable reasons, and to realize that they now want to talk to the French, and de Gaulle would probably smile in his tomb for making the choices he made in the 50s and 60s. That's a major shift, and clearly I don't think NATO is probably going to be different after this than it was before. When it comes to the United Nations, Alisher, I think that, again, this is very serious stuff, especially if you take the World Health Organization, for instance, which will have a very hard time recovering from its current crisis. Again, it's not the first time, US pulled out of UNESCO in the 80s, and UNESCO is still around. So it's important to keep that in mind. But I think the real problem of the United Nations, and that's a structural problem, is funding. And it's not just the United Nations. I think we see it with particular equity at the United Nations, but the sort of the Western states that were for a long time at the forefront of these organizations are all facing structural fiscal crisis. There's absolutely no sign that public debt will improve in the short, medium term, and even perhaps longer term. And what that means is that international organizations are going to remain very deeply challenged in terms of making money. And if you look at how the United Nations has reacted to that crisis, it's actually very worrying, right? It's decided to embark on a trajectory of earmarked funding. There's a really good book by Aaron Graham on this. maybe a couple of years ago. So it's essentially voluntary funding, that IOs have become sort of fun entrepreneurs, right? They go around and go to different states and private corporations and foundations that find money and then they administer that money. They don't make programs anymore, right? But they just administer the money that other people want to spend on different things. And that's for me a real big change. I'm actually working on a book project on this right now. Not so much about the earmark funding, but about the staff of internationalizations, which is very different from what it used to be and from the sort of the ideal of the international civil service. And so I think that that's where, the funny, it's not so funny, but the funny thing about this is that this is not Trump, right? This is not a trend that one can say, oh, since Trump arrived, IOs are challenged. No, this is something that's been building up for decades, that accelerated, especially at the turn of the millennium. And that's why I'm saying this is structural stuff, right? It's not about Trump. It's not about the global right, even though definitely they're not fans of the UN. But those problems actually predate, right? They were also created by the third way and the more liberal or leftist, center-left governments before. And so far, doing that research, Alisher, I haven't seen anything that suggests a way out of this. Something will happen, right? But right now, it's much more about a deepening of those trends. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people think, I believe, that the UN needs real big reforms. But one of the most essential problem is that to make a big reforms, especially changing Security Council structure, current members of Security Council should vote for that. But perhaps it would be very difficult to expect from them that they would be very happy to change the structure. They will tend to stay with their power, their roles, their status. It is very difficult. I don't know how this might be resolved. But anyway, I remember you published some article, perhaps in the beginning of 2010 or 11, about the future of diplomacy. So now, after 15 years, how do you see this future? Do you still think that in the same terms, or the future of diplomacy for you now it's something quite unexpected?
So you're referring to a project I did with Iver Neumann and Ole Jacob Sending, both the special issue in International Journal, but then there was also the edited book, Diplomacy in the Making of World Politics. I think what Ole Jacob, Iver, and myself tried to say there were two big things. One was when we think about the future of diplomacy, what's important is the structure of the relationships between sort of the professional diplomats, those who claim jurisdictions over diplomacy based on their connections with states, right, as being representatives of states, and all of these other would-be diplomats that also make claims to the global, whether they're NGOs or private corporations or cities and so on and so forth. And our claim was, it's not like one will replace the other. It's rather that the structure of their relationship will evolve, right? That was claim one. Claim two was about sort of where do they take their authority from? And so states, of course, claim their authority from representing a basis of constituents, that's based territorially within the state. Whereas a bunch of other actors will base their authority claims on moral values, on all kinds of, religion, and so on and so forth. Where I think perhaps I would think slightly different today when I see the rise of the global right is that there is I would say, let me put it differently. I would say the club of states is much more resilient than what sometimes we may be tempted to think, in the sense that even the global right challenge right now, I think, is founded on the state system. You know, their so-called enemy is Davos, right? Which they think is the new class and the transnational cosmopolitan elite that does
Right.
not belong to any states. And so, in a way, even that is reinforcing um, the club of states. What for me is really intriguing, Alisher, is especially when I think about that, is the fact that, you know, on the face of it, there's this clash between, let's call it the liberal order, Davos and the global right. Um, so they, you know, at the same time, though, both of these diplomatic endeavors are very deeply embedded in global capitalism, right? So, you know, no one's more capitalist than Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Donald Trump, if you think about it, right? Um, and when they chastise Davos, right? For me, there's something unstable there, right? I can see the populist line, but structurally speaking, in terms of political economy, right, I see far more commonalities between some of these global capitalists and the so-called global right. It's
Mm.
couched in different language, right? The state
Very
first, right? America first, and that kind of stuff.
interesting.
But it's still about making money and the state serving
Right, right.
the economy. And
Mm.
that is a very clear ideological convergence on the right, in my view. And so maybe it's only a matter of time before that convergence actually emerges
Mm.
up again. So far, it's been convenient, I think, to use populist versus cosmopolitan tropes to
Mm.
oppose one another. The reality is at the bottom, though, they both want this capitalist world to continue.
Mm.
And eventually, I cannot believe that that won't play out in some ways, but I just don't know how. Yeah.
Very interesting combination. You mentioned the resilience of the state. How about non-governmental organizations, their role in diplomacy? There are a lot of scholars and practitioners now, they say, well, non-governmental organizations like transnational companies and others are playing much more and bigger and very essential role in modern diplomacy. And their role will be even bigger in the future. How's your view on that?
I'd be reluctant to make broad sweeping generalizations on this. I think that there are cases where obviously, for instance, private corporations um, will have not only a larger say, but also a bigger stake in the, you know, I'm thinking, for instance, Alisha, about insurance companies and climate change, right? Uh, it's hard to find an actor, a category of actor that's more actively engaged in climate change politics than insurance companies. Why? Because it's costing them billions and billions and billions in damage, climate change induced damage and claims. And so, you know, whether that has translated into a kind of a global diplomacy to an extent, but a lot of their work currently is through the state, right? So they will try to develop partnerships with states. I think another case where we see something similar, different but similar, is with AI. You know, when I think about the world, the most concerning thing, I think, for me, even more than climate change, because I think it's more immediate in its effect, is the concentration of political, economic capital and technological capital in the hands of a few individuals, a few corporations who know more about each of us, then, you know, the KGB would pale in comparison during the Cold War in terms of being able to read its citizens and class. I mean, the way that it's developed means that, and I don't want to sound like conspirational because that's not at all the point. The point is these companies are huge. They're oligopolistic because to enter into that market, you already have to be huge, right? Which means that nobody's able to compete with those that are already established. And they have now an amount of power and capability that is larger than most states. And in many ways, states are dependent on
Mm.
technologies for their services to citizens. I mean, if you take the United Nations, it's entering all kinds of partnerships with Microsoft, with others. I mean, like their own policy making
Right.
depends on private corporations. And so for me, that's, you asked the question, what about these other actors? I think that their influence is not necessarily where we look for it, right? If you go to a UN conference and you expect corporations to talk loud and be at the table and sign the agreements, I don't see that coming anytime soon, because states exert a clear monopoly over these tools, right? They don't want to share them, as you mentioned before. But if we think in more groundswell terms, right, I think that the influence is absolutely huge, in part because states are dependent on these corporations at various levels. I've just given you a couple of examples. For NGOs, um, I think NGOs are important, but a lot of the hype of the 90s was probably slightly exaggerated. It's not that they don't play a role. It's not that they don't have an important contribution to make, but their influence, depends on the state. If we think about these relational configurations, and just for that reason, they will always be constrained by the intergovernmental agenda, whether it's more open or more closed, and so on and so forth. So I think that one thing we can realize now is that um, with a more fragmented global public sphere, it's much harder for NGOs to exert the kind of influence that they did in the 90s, when everything was about human rights and capitalism and so on and so forth. NGOs now have to cope with very polarized politics, and that shrinks their space. Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, we'll see.
No, exactly. I'm not trying to make predictions. I'm just, if we read what's going on right now, it seems to me
Right,
that
right.
those are some of the trends. But indeed, you're absolutely right. The future is open, and who knows what will happen.
Okay. You mentioned digital diplomacy.
Yeah.
I see two clear trends in understanding, reflecting on digital diplomacy and its role in the future. On the one hand, everything would be digitalized, and it is the main important trends, and we will see much more digital diplomacy in the future. But on the other hand, there are perhaps mostly diplomats themselves. They say, well, that's okay, that's important, but still real diplomacy is happening behind the closed doors. Still, classical diplomacy, interpersonal relationship, and negotiation is the most important thing. And we could not expect that digital or digitalization will replace all these things. So how do you see the role of digital diplomacy in the future of diplomatic practice?
Well, I don't think we can oppose these two patterns you just described, right? They're much more complementary than so the kinds of things that are done behind closed doors versus the kinds of things that are done on social media are just very different. They're connected, very intimately connected, because negotiators use social media and digital platforms toward
To influence.
their objectives, and then translate the leverage they may have gained publicly in private negotiations. So they're connected, but I don't know that it's not like either one wins over the other. You see what I mean? I think there's been a lot of really interesting work already done on, for instance, how uh, digitalization pushes even further the power of images, for instance, that had already started with TV, 75 years ago. The sort of the diffusion of influence as well via social media. Everybody can have a handle. The importance of publicity, right? And the fact that a lot of the negotiation ground goes public. One thing that I find very important and that hasn't gotten much attention so far, I'm working on it. Actually, it's a second book project. I know I shouldn't be doing that, but that's about how AI assisted translation is transforming social relations writ large, but especially diplomacy, right? So, you
Yes.
know, the Babel fish, remember in sci-fi, like the instant translation, that was one of these crazy ideas just a couple of decades ago that, of course, in sci-fi or Star Trek or that kind of stuff, and it's there, right? Everybody has instant translation on their cell phone today. You can actually have an interaction with anyone using these technologies, which are free and very reliable. And again, I don't want to come across like over enthusiastic, because that's not my point. This is all very political. It's very imperfect. It raises all kinds of challenges and dilemmas, but it's there. It's out there. And for diplomats, well, for usual citizens, I keep wondering myself, Alisher, are people really going to invest hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours, learning foreign languages when, let's say our kids or our grandkids, when actually, what's the point of it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Apart from the romantic thing, I want to know other people, which again, is very dear to my heart. I don't want to, it's not, I believe in that, right? But I'm also able to see, well, expediency is the engine of humans. And so, if you can get around linguistic barriers very freely and rapidly, I think a lot of people will be tempted, and that includes diplomats. And I wonder,
Absolutely.
there's already been shifting linguistic grounds. That's what this book that I'm working on talks about. For instance, English as a working language that has been picking up for decades now, and that's a significant change in diplomacy that I want to talk about in the book. But AI translation is also a major shift, and few people know about that. But actually, the United Nations, for instance, was at the forefront of that shift, right? Long before AI became this thing with Google Translate and DeepL, I mean, the United Nations was already working on its own software and databases to do machine translation, like in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? Why? Because they had this very quality corpus of translated texts by human beings, right? Professional translators, and they could train early computers on this. And so I think I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. Is it reinforcing actually the dominance of English, or is it suggesting that we will be able to dispense with a lingua franca in the future because everybody's going to be able to speak in their language? These algorithms also are very unequal, depending on how large your digital archive is, the better translation is. I don't know how Google Translate is, for instance, in Kazakh or in other languages, but I'm assuming that because the digital archive is way smaller, they're less functional, right? They're less accurate, and so it reinstills certain forms of inequality. But I think, the jury's out, Alisher. You're asking me questions about the future, which is fun to do, but I'm pretty convinced, though, that
Future is happening now.
yeah, well, AI and translation is going to change the nature of diplomacy.
Absolutely, I fully agree.
Yeah.
Even if you would compare, let's say a year ago or 2 years ago or a few years ago, quality of translation, for example, with Google
Oh yeah.
translation or AI, but
Yeah.
and now it's a huge difference. It's
Absolutely.
much more with real quality, which was not the case a few years ago. And
And
I
if you look, just quickly, Alisha, on this, if you look at how a lot of international organizations, but also NGOs,
right,
use it, they don't translate their websites. I'm not talking about the UN here. I'm talking about smaller organizations. They don't translate their websites anymore. So they do only an English version website, and then they use the Google Translate API, right, on the screen. So if you want to translate the page, you can do it via
yeah,
Google Translate, but the organization itself is not providing a translation anymore. That's a huge change because it means that we rely on a private company to communicate across cultures and languages about political stuff.
right,
That's not
right.
innocuous, right? It is significant.
And wording, structure, presenting the concepts. So now we are relying more and more on machines,
Yeah.
not just the pages. So with this development, of course, that would affect also international organizations, their budgeting, their structure, all those things.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's precisely the reason why Alisher diplomacy is going to be changed by AI-assisted translation, is that the political pressure to cut down on these costs is tremendous, not just at the EU, also at the UN. And just for that reason, these organizations, they've already started to do it, by the way, so it's already happening. They will turn to AI technology precisely because they're under such fiscal pressure that they're
Right.
not able to continue to have professional translators
Mm.
the way that they have over the past few decades. So
Mm.
this is not tomorrow. It's today.
Right. Well, since we are talking about tomorrow, about future and current situation related to future, let me ask you about diplomatic skills. How do you think, what kinds of skills would be demanded in the future? Is it more technological skills or still some human skills? So, how do you see diplomatic skills in the future?
That's a tough question. I think if I had to formulate an answer, I would go back to some Faizullaev articles and books to help me, because you're the one who's been thinking much more seriously and analytically about diplomatic skills than I ever have. Um,
Okay.
so let's go back to Alisher's works, but to add my little 2 cents here, I think that some of the things we've already talked about for me would still resonate with that question. I think that, so for instance, if we take seriously the fact that there will be a decrease in, I think, it's already started, it's been going on for decades, but let's say there will be a decrease in language skills in
Hmm.
diplomatic corps. Well, what that means is that the linguistic skills will also increase in value because they will become more rare, right? So there's again something paradoxical to it, but so I think that there will be ways in which, despite all the trends toward AI assisted translation, those few who still master foreign languages and develop cultural um, competence will have some value. It's just that it will distribute differently. I guess that will be a different kind of specialization, if you wish. Um, and I also think that one of the things that people have to internalize including diplomats, in a world that is as troubled as ours and seems to be um, developing in that way, you know, for a longer term than just the next few months, is precisely, not just the importance of history, but also the importance of remaining steady. I think that, I'm thinking, the way that Canada, for instance, reacted first to the Trump challenge, with our prime minister flying to Mar-a-Lago uninvited, and then that was the beginning of like a very bad thing, just panicking essentially, right? And giving in and just, I think that that's clearly one thing that we've been learning the hard way here, and also is probably going to be very useful for diplomats. There's sort of the sea foam of politics, Alicia, and there's the groundswell of diplomacy. And it's, diplomacy's contribution precisely is in staying the course, not in the conservative way of not being sensitive to the changes. Obviously, one has to be sensitive to the changes, but keeping some distance, some perspective, knowing where this world is coming from, how it's developed. These are actually very important skills in a moment of polarization and very active sort of political conflict. And so I don't know if it's a skill in your mind, but it seems to me that that's really needed right now in the world and probably into the future.
Yeah. Well, I would say this in my framing, it's a judgment, sound
Right.
judgment, which is perhaps one of the most fundamental skills in diplomacy. You
Yeah.
have to be good in judgment. All right. So perhaps my last question is that you spent a lot of time, years in studying diplomatic practices in the fields and also theorizing them. So if you would say a few words to young diplomats or students or those who would like to be a diplomat in the future, what insight would you like to share with them? Anything to say to those who would like to be a good diplomat and good professional in this field?
One thing I've learned, and I'm afraid it's not going to be super positive and may shock you a little bit, Alisher, but one thing I've learned after a few 2, 3 decades studying diplomacy and that troubles me today, is that diplomacy is conservative in many ways, but especially in the sense that if you look at the challenges we face these days, one often gets the sense that diplomats, because they work for the state in the majority of them at least, they're actually defending the state. They're defending the state system. More so, I find, and maybe I'm just getting old and more, skeptical than I used to be, but more so than fighting for the cause, for instance, curbing climate change, or justice when it comes to social justice, for instance, when it comes to trade negotiations or socioeconomic inequalities. And I teach undergraduate students who are very, and I admire them for that, very idealistic, right? They want to change the world, as they should. That's the purpose of the youth, right? Is to reject, at least in part, the world that they're born into and try to mold it to their taste. But the problem is, and it's not their fault, when they entered this diplomatic world and apparatus, the pressure for conservative thinking, just like oil the system, oil the machinery, defend the national interest, is very, very strong. And so I'm still in touch with former students, and it's not like they've lost their reflexivity or their critical edge, but it's just that they've been not swallowed, that's too strong, but they've had to learn to operate within these machineries that frustrates them a lot because they feel like their creativity and their reflexivity is
within the structure existing.
exactly. And it's, if they want to progress in their career trajectory, they have to abide by this more conservative bent. And so in that sense, I think I wouldn't want to quash any vocations among our students, but I think that we have as teachers and professors, Alisher, we have a duty to clarify the challenges that they will face from year one, from day one that you enter these big organizations. All organizations are like that, but I'm not thinking just about states, by the way. Also the United Nations, I have former students who worked for the UN and eventually quit because they couldn't take the sort of very conservative, very sort of status quo oriented.
Bureaucratic.
Yeah. And so that's our challenge, right? We teach our students to think big, be critical, be reflexive, but then we also know that as soon as we let them go with their diploma and their robe, that they're going to be part of machines that actually is going to, not systematically, but overwhelmingly turn them into cogs in the machine. And for me, I'm frustrated about that when I think about it. I haven't found a solution, but yeah.
That's a very good advice, in fact, because what you are saying, you are you are not saying that you should not go or it's not a good thing, but you are saying that you will have a lot of challenges.
Yeah. Know what you're getting into is
Yeah,
essentially.
actually, you have to know this, and this is more realistic perspective. And of course, we have to take this into account.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Anything you would like to add?
That was a great conversation. Thanks, Alisher. You remind me of those coffees we had at McGill when you were with us a decade ago. I mean, very happy to reconnect, and good luck with your project. I think it's great. I've watched a couple of episodes that you've already done, and so long life to your YouTube episodes.
Well, thank you so much, Vincent. You are absolutely wonderful, both scholar and personality. So it is always very happy, very, very nice to talk to you. And I've got always a lot of energy, insights, and some inspiration. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. You take care, Alisher.
Thank you.